Hi.
Jesus.
Oh, no, welcome.
Give me a glass of water,
Oh,
please.
you.
Note to Frightmare on the Falls. Don't position your Q&A room 2 flights of stairs up from the signing room.
There's elevators, Dad.
I need a nap now. Talk amongst yourselves. Sorry.
We've been talking amongst ourselves for a while.
Well, nobody came to get me.
Oh, was I supposed to come get you? Was I supposed to summon
I
you?
don't know where the hell I'm
It's
supposed
funny
to
because
go.
I made that joke, but I didn't do it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everyone. Well, let's get underway then, because we don't have a whole lot of time. I was talking before you got here about how a year ago I'd written Hellraiser was on the cover of Remorse for the 30th anniversary. And I spoke to Clive, and you were interviewed by one of my colleagues. And you had noted in that interview that Hellraiser it seems like Hellraiser is even more popular now than it was 30 years ago, partially because it hasn't really aged at all. So can you elaborate a bit on why Hellraiser remains relevant and appealing after all these years?
Relevant. It's a worrying word. I don't know whether it was ever relevant. Yeah, I mean, it is my feeling that it's more popular now than it's ever been. It seems to be growing and growing. I see it reflected at the conventions. I see it reflected in the number of requests I have for interviews. That's partly, I think, a consequence of the explosion of the internet and the podcast generation. Everybody has a podcast and everybody wants to interview somebody, it seems now. There's a degree of big hair and shoulder pads going on in Hellraiser that absolutely places it in the 1980s. There's no disputing that. But it seems to me that there's an awful lot of elements by design or accident in Hellraiser that just are never going to age. And part of that is the universality of the story. And I think a lot of it is the genius of a man called Clive Barker, who was able to take the contemporary mores of the horror film. I've always argued that you could take, I don't know why you'd want to, but you could take the Cenobites out of the story of Hellraiser, and you have yourself a fairly dull but fairly serviceable slasher film on your hands, in which, you know, mattress is delivered to house, and you have the backstory of Julia and Frank and the blood on the floor, and Frank comes back to life, and Julia goes out to clubs to bring guys home, to kill them, to feed blood to Frank, and Kirsty comes into the mix, and it's a family slasher movie. Clive takes all that, and then he drops gothic horror with a great big capital G into the middle of it, called the Cenobites, who could have walked straight out of a Hieronymus Bosch painting. And I've always said that you could show images of the Cenobites to a 12th century monk, and he would absolutely get it. He would know immediately what he was looking at. And if this whole crazy shit show is still around in a few hundred years' time, the Cenobites will not have aged. They are timeless and ageless, and they don't really belong anywhere. They don't belong in 1980s suburban London. They don't belong in a family home. But there they are, right in the middle of it. So those elements of it don't age. And because you've got that kind of contemporary horror film with something much bigger, and because I think the centrality of the story, which I've always argued is basically the story of Dr. Faustus, the point at which Faustus says in Christopher Marlowe's play, which I know was always a huge influence on Clive, enormous influence on Clive. I think you see its influence in an awful lot of his work. He says he's studied everything. He's explored everything. and he still doesn't have the answers, and it's still not enough. I think it's Frankie Hellbound said, actually has the line, it's never enough. The need to go further, the need to go beyond, the need to go beyond, beyond, beyond. And in Marlowe's play, that's the point that Mephistopheles appears to Faustus and says, oh, you want more? Oh, I can show you more. There's a little price you have to pay, which is we get your soul, but I can show you everything. I have such sights to show you. That's absolutely the centrality of the bargain in Hellraiser, and it's a universal thing, I think.
Absolutely. Well said.
And then there's sadomasochism as well, but
I guess that's what I was getting at. Like when I say relevant, is when you look at this film and you look at the taboos that it's busting, all the sexuality, all the repressed sexuality, all the desire and stuff like that. That's still the stuff of today.
Well, again, that's absolutely central to anything and everything that Clive has ever done. There's nothing he's ever touched that sex isn't close to. But that's true of the human condition, I think, whether it's expressed sexuality or repressed sexuality or sexuality denied or sexuality perverted, whatever it is, it's Freud wasn't wrong. Well, he was up to a point.
Sometimes a cigar.
It defined what Carl Gustav Jung said about Freud. He said the problem is that before Freud, nothing was sexual. After Freud, everything is sexual. And to Jung, that was a problem because there was, yes, everything is sexual, but everything is more than that, and besides that as well. But it's always been central.
And yet, when you look at the figure of Pinhead, I think it's Hellraiser 3, where his own backstory is revealed, that he is a war vet who has just seen so many atrocities of war that he goes to the puzzle box, perhaps as a means of escape. It's not quite a sexual thing.
Well, he's kind of... Oh, no, Pinhead is entirely asexual. Mm-hmm. Oh, totally asexual. I have no more surprises. To me, he lives in an emotional no man's land. I think that's his curse. The interesting thing for me in that process was that approaching playing Pinhead in Hellraiser, I knew he'd once been human. And I had no idea who, and I had no idea when, and I had no idea where. And we never explored that. Talking to Clive, that never got explored, but I knew it was there as an element. One of the things I felt about Pinhead, which was born the first time I had the makeup on and I sat in front of the mirror for 20 minutes and just looked at this thing and tried to gauge what I felt he was, I found 95% of my performance in that 15, 20 minutes just by looking at this. And I had and I think it's there in the screenplay as well. There's a great sense of heaviness and melancholy about him.
Tragedy.
Even when he's making jokes, and in the screenplay of Hellraiser, I made a note that "No tears, please, it's a waste of good suffering" is a gag and should make people laugh, but in an uncomfortable kind of way. There's a heaviness about that humor. There's a "No tears, please, it's a waste of good suffering" because suffering is so precious to me, and it's clearly not a good place to be, to find suffering a precious element. But I hung that melancholy on a sense of mourning for his humanity that he didn't know and he couldn't remember and he couldn't connect with. It all also made sense to me of why he's so endlessly fascinated by human beings, why he wants to confront them, talk to them, and pull out their secrets from their dirty little cobwebbed corners, because we've all got them, and that's what he wants to know about. It then gets explored a little bit further in Hellbound, and we place him as Captain Elliot Spencer. Still in the British Army, not in the First World War, but he's because of budget cutbacks, it never got explored fully, but he's actually in India in the early 1920s, having stayed in the British Army and fighting the Indian mutinies. You hear it, the Indian Bazaar that is revisited in Hellraiser 3, and on the radio at the beginning of Hellbound, it's Indian music and Indian voices. If you listen very carefully, those are the only clues you get that were in India. For Hellraiser 3, Pete Atkins wanted to establish the idea of Hell on Earth as being two particular touchstones. For America, that Hell on Earth, that nightmare is Vietnam, and for Great Britain, the United Kingdom, that Hell on Earth was the First World War. And I knew Pete was writing that element in, and I was watching, purely coincidentally, a documentary on the BBC with interviews of survivors from the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. And I don't know how many people are familiar with the Battle of the Somme. Who's not at all? It was 1915 or 1916. It was going to be the big breakthrough. Huge recruitment and big build-up of troops on the British in the British trenches. And remember, the Germans are here and the Brits are here, and the middle is no man's land, and nobody's moving. And for years, nothing has moved. So the Battle of the Somme was going to break through the German trenches for days and days and days beforehand. Aerial bombardment of the German trenches. And the British troops were told that when you're given the signal to go over the top and into no man's land, there will be no German guns because they've all been taken out by the aerial bombardment. When I say aerial bombardment, I don't mean planes. What do I mean? Mortar bombardment. Artillery, that's the word I'm looking for. Unfortunately, most of it was falling short. And the Germans had very, very efficient trenches that went underground so they could get away from the bombardment. They were also tunneling underneath no man's land and listening, so they knew what was planned. So on the day of the battle, when the bombardment was lifted, the British troops were told to walk across no man's land in battalion formation, line abreast. And this is all barbed wire with gaps in the barbed wire. So they come up out of the trenches one by one to form formation and then march across. You're a German gunner. When the bombardment was lifted and there was a long delay, the troops should have started their advancement under cover of darkness. They didn't. It was broad daylight. You're a German gunner behind your machine gun, and opposite you there's a gap in the barbed wire. And one British soldier appears, followed by another British soldier, followed by another British soldier. Boom, 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 boom. In the first 24 hours of the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. It's the blackest day in the history of the British Army. And that battle went on for months, at the end of which about half a mile of territory had been won at the cost of millions of lives. And these were local battalions in the British Army, very, very localized, like Niagara Falls would have its own battalion. So everybody knew everybody else. And these guys talked about roll call next day, where names were being called out, you know, Anderson, Bradley, Davis, Davidson, present, and so on. You know, silence, silence, present, present, silence, silence. These would be brothers, these would be cousins. And this one survivor said in his interview that he felt as though he was a cheat. And he was now 80 years old, or 90 years old. He belonged dead on the battlefield with his comrades. He felt he did not have the right to be alive.
Survivor's guilt.
Because they had died. He should have been dead with them. And I saw that and I thought, that's it. That's Eliot's motivation. That's why he's looking for the lament configuration, because he wants out of this hell,
right,
into that hell.
Right.
So that was where, for me, everything tied up at that point.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, it was a very long-winded
No,
answer.
no, that's a fascinating history lesson. But then it wound up kind of being that India context, which kind of places, it really changes things, right? So it puts him on the side of the oppressor.
Oh, very much so, yes. Yeah. Well, not in his mind.
Okay.
He's a soldier in the British Army. India is part of the British Empire.
Yeah, but there's soldiers. Okay.
I'm not defending it.
Okay,
I'm just
okay,
saying.
right. I'm just trying to understand Pinhead. So my next question, this is a fan theory that I heard recently, and it goes back to how we were saying how Pinhead is completely asexual, and this fan theory posits that according to the book, if you look really closely at how Pinhead is described in the book, that it might have been a woman, and that the wounds in his chest might have been some breasts that are no longer there. In translating Pinhead to screen, was there ever any discussion about gender?
No, but I'm going to do Hellraiser the transgender story now.
Yes, that's what I wanted.
Pinhead will assert his right to use the bathroom of his choice in the next Hellraiser film. No.
No.
Well, I've read the Hellbound Heart. I don't remember. I mean, it is true that in the Hellbound Heart, he's very much described as a he. He's referred to as he.
That's the pronoun, yeah.
He's not so prominent in the Hellbound Heart, but it's the female Cenobite who is the driver, more than Pinhead, not named, all anonymous in Hellbound Heart and in Hellraiser. Clive does describe him in the book as having a light and breathy voice, like that of an excited girl. I wasn't going to do that in the movie. I'll tear your soul apart. It might not have carried so much resonance down the years. But Clive has never suggested that to me. It's certainly never come into my thoughts.
All right. Well, so it was a fan theory.
Anyway, we know he was a man.
We know he was a man.
Yes.
We know now.
Watch the damn movies.
We know now. But at the beginning, like you said, there was no backstory yet, right?
Well, this is true.
Okay. What's your favorite fan theory? Or maybe what's your least favorite fan theory? You kind of cringed. Have you heard some doozies?
That one.
Not really, no. I don't pay attention.
Oh, God.
Fan theories. I don't know. I can't remember. I've no doubt I've heard some.
That's okay.
I smile politely.
So you've read...
I give the impression I care, but
breaking my heart. I'm tearing my soul apart. You've read the Scarlet Gospels.
I have.
And so when I was talking to Clive about the Scarlet Gospels, of course I asked him if it'd ever be made. He said it couldn't because it would be too expensive. And if it were expensive, they wouldn't let him make it the way he wanted. Would you agree with that?
It's very hard to disagree with that. I wish it would happen. For me, if I'm going to, it would be the perfect closure to the whole merry-go-round.
It really is the perfect closure to Pinhead.
Yes. I mean, he's right obviously in the sense that he has opened this up into an area that the Hellraiser films never went. I've just been partly writing about this. I'm writing a foreword to a book that's going to be published next year called Scared Sacred, which is exploring ideas of religion in horror films. And I was talking in the foreword about how, to me, that the hell of Hellraiser was never theologically specific. Nobody ever refers to the devil or Satan in relation to whatever the hell of Hellraiser is. And in Hellbound, when Kirsty goes into hell looking for Frank, looking for her father, Frank, she encounters Frank. He says he is in his own hell, just as you are in yours. It was very much that, for me, that idea that hell is a personal place that we create for ourselves out of the life we lead, if we're going to even consider the possibility of any kind of existence after death, which I'm not sure I personally believe in anyway. And there's a quote by John Milton, Paradise Lost. I'm no doubt paraphrasing and I'll get it slightly wrong, but the mind is a place unto itself and can create a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. And it always seemed to me that's very relevant to Hellraiser, angels to some, demons to others. That, again, that's partly why I say I think Pinhead is asexual. His blankness. Am I an angel? Am I a demon? Am I neither? Am I both? I don't know. You decide. Whatever you want me to be, I'll be that for you, I think is what he's saying. But Clive in the Scarlet Gospels explodes this open onto this Miltonic, cosmological, theological level. And all the stuff with Lucifer and Pinhead defeating Lucifer and donning Lucifer's armor. It's on a huge scale on that level and on a pretty dramatic scale on the earthly level as well. You know, with green, it would be an awful lot of green screen filming, and green screen these days brings down the budget of these huge scale settings. It would be nice if it happened.
You're not holding your breath. How many of you have read it? It's wonderful. And what I like about it is it doesn't do away with the rest of the franchise, which it could, and maybe it should.
Well, I think Clive said he himself that he was very much kind of thumbing his nose at the movies.
Yes.
Saying, you know, you take my baby, you do that to it, fuck you, take this.
So speaking of the franchise, you've kept up with the franchise?
Well, I was kind of in it for the most part.
For the most part. But after it lost you, I think we can all agree that that's where it really kind of went off the rails. And most Hellraiser fans know that a lot of recent Hellraiser movies don't really feel like Hellraiser movies because they weren't supposed to be Hellraiser movies. And they just kind of got injected with some Hellraiser by Dimension to hang on to the franchise.
Well, now, to be fair, that's true of Inferno, Hellseeker, and Deader. They were all pre-existing screenplays that were tweaked to become Hellraiser movies. So it pre-exists the end of that first part of the franchise.
Right.
Personally, I think that's lazy. I think they could easily have found original Hellraiser stories.
Yes.
Anyway, I interrupted.
That's okay. My question for you is there a movie in existence that you wish could have gotten that Hellraiser injection? Is there a movie in existence that you feel like Pinhead could have just walked out of the wall and just fucked shit up?
Oh, he could do that in almost any movie. That would be fun, wouldn't it? Drop Pinhead into an Adam Sandler movie. Tear his fucking soul apart. I don't know. Name your movie. I think it.
Do you guys have any ideas?
I think we could work with it.
Yeah. You're right, because it's got that timelessness. And like you said, Pinhead, I've always thought of him as he's more the executioner's axe than the executioner. He doesn't make judgments, he just responds.
Oh, it's true. And when I was approaching Hellraiser, which was my first movie, I had the shorthand in my head. I'm going to play a monster in a horror film. You know, how cool is that? But reading the screenplay, making the film, you know, I come to the realization that actually, and this was by design, this was Clive's intent, that Pinhead is not the monster in the film. The monsters in the film are Julia and Frank. That's a familiar theme in Clive's work as well, writ large in Nightbreed. You know, the freaks just want to be left alone to live their freakish lives, and it's the humans who are the monsters and won't leave them be, and you know, want to make them conform to their idea of what normality is, and that is a rejection that again is absolutely fundamental, I think, to all of Clive's work. So yeah, I realized very quickly that that's not what he is. He is like he's a referee. He's a judge in the sense that judges operate the law, which is a moral process, are themselves stand outside the process of the morality of what's going on in the court case, to stand above it and apply a legal framework. Yeah, he's very rule bound.
Yes.
Until Hell on Earth, when he gets out of the box and he can go and play. But he's very rule bound. He's bound by the limits of the box.
I love how we can talk about him like he's just a person. He's just a person we know. There's not a whole lot of horror movie characters.
He said he'd be along in a minute.
Ooh. Nice. Any questions from you guys for Doug when we get done? Doug Bradley's here. He's right there. Hi.
I just wanted to, I heard that you would accept the role of Pinhead in the first Hellraiser unless the makeup was changed. Is that true?
No.
No.
What did you hear?
Well, I heard that you would accept the role of Pinhead unless they changed up the makeup and like I guess the way the makeup was set up.
Absolutely not. No. Interesting. I wish I wouldn't. It wouldn't have crossed my mind to take that attitude. Absolutely not. No. It was what it was. The makeup was designed between Clive and Jeff Portas, who created the makeup and did my live cast and did my applications on Hellraiser and Hellbound. No, not true. We can strike that fan theory down.
So speaking of your makeup, I think a lot of fans know that you almost wound up in a different role in this film.
Oh God!
You don't have to tell it again. That's not my question.
Okay.
Do you want me to just speed through that?
Go
so
ahead.
he was going to be one of the mattress movers.
No, I wasn't. I was always going to play Pinhead. Clive had approached me about playing Pinhead. We talked about me playing Pinhead. When we were getting close to filming, Chris Figg called me and he said, "Okay, we're coming to it, and it's time we start to talk a bit of Turkey." By the way, there is this other part still available, which was the mattress delivery guy. I mentioned this in one damn interview, and I wish to God I'd kept my mouth shut, because it is following me around like a bad fart, I tell you. It won't go away. And there was a moment where I thought, this was my first film, and I thought, well, wait a minute. If I'm going to be in a movie, maybe I should be visible. Maybe I should be seen, so that if I'm going to an audition, and the director says, well, what have you been in lately that we may have seen you? Well, I was that guy in Hellraiser. Oh, yeah. As opposed to this guy with not much more screen time, with no name, buried in latex. There was a moment where I thought, from a purely actorly point of view, maybe I should think about that. But, you know, this guy with the nails and the thing, there was always something a little bit more interesting going on with him than a guy delivering a mattress, you know. And if I'd made that decision, I doubt whether I'd be sitting here today discussing my role as the mattress delivery guy in Hellraiser. But it was a split-second thought process. There was never any design or intention that I'm aware of that I would play that role.
Okay, all right. Well, another fan theory debunked. But I mean, you can understand why that myth is so delicious, because you went on to become such a huge horror icon. You yourself as Pinhead himself in the grander pantheon of horror. And further to that, in 1996, you wrote a book about being the man behind the mask. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I did. It's available on my table as we speak. Okay. Still in print. I had been asked to do an illustrated lecture here in the States, college and university audiences. And what I wanted to do was pull together a lot of disparate elements, really, because I'd always been interested in masking. In the 10 years or so of theatre work that I'd done with Clive prior to Hellraiser, we'd done a lot of masked work. And I was aware that in the birth of theatre in ancient Greece, every actor was masked. No actor ever went on stage with their own face. These were rigid masks that had a fixed expression, or something that would delineate a fixed profession. They would have been horrified by the idea that you would go on stage as a human being. You were always on stage as a representation of something bigger than the merely human. So I wanted to pull all those elements together and look at other actors in relation to their makeup in the history of horror films, because many of them were inspirational to me as a fan of horror films as a teenager before I knew I wanted to be an actor, and approaching Hellraiser. So I pulled all of these things together. So I talk early on briefly about the cultural history of masking, primitive ideas of masking, that if you put on the mask of an animal, you're not just, as we would understand it, pretending to be that animal. You are, in some sense, becoming that animal. So if you put on a lion mask, you may not be a lion, but you are partaking of the bigger idea of lion with a capital L. And that origin in theatre and the Japanese No tradition of masked theatre, and then into horror films. And so I've looked at Lon Chaney Sr., Lon Chaney Jr., and Charles Laughton's performance as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Frederick March as Jekyll and Hyde, Jean Cocteau's film of La Belle et la Bête, Beauty and the Beast, Jean Marais, his performance, which is a favourite film of mine, a wonderful performance by Marais. And I wrote to him, and I got a letter back from him, which is one of my prized, treasured profession, talking about him with Jean Cocteau, who is one of my heroes, artistic heroes. And then coming up gradually to the present day, and I did my own interviews with Gunnar Hansen, with Kane Hodder, with Robert Englund, and then talked about my own experience of Pinhead and the Pinhead makeup. And different actors have related to this in different ways. In Lon Chaney Sr., it was like a religious calling for him. He designed his own makeups, he made his own makeups, he applied his own makeups, and he wore his own and put himself through hell and high water to get to the veracity of the characters he was playing in the process. Somebody like Charles Lawton had a very, very bad relationship to both his makeup and his makeup artist through the process of making The Hunchback a brilliant performance at the end of the day anyway, but not a happy process getting there.
Interesting.
So that's I published it as Sacred Monsters.
Yes.
Behind the Mask of the Horror Actor. Then it got cancelled. And then I was contacted by Titan Books, who said, we've got new distributors in the States, Random House, and they've been through our old list, and they settled on your book and asked us why we'd cancelled it. So we're uncancelling it.
Oh, great.
But they want to rename it Behind the Mask of the Horror Actor.
That's why. Okay, so 2 listings.
Well, their argument was if you're looking down the spines of books and you see Sacred Monsters, it doesn't mean anything. If you see Behind the Mask of the Horror Actor, you go, oh, what's that about?
The spines, so books.
I still like Sacred Monsters.
What are we at for time, Des? How much time do we have? 5 minutes? 12. Okay, that's all right. Any other questions for Doug? Yeah. Okay.
I was wondering, before you were in Hellraiser, were you always into the horror genre?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So did you kind of absorb you after?
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, as a young boy, for me, it was ghosts. I couldn't get enough of them. They scared the lights out of me, but I couldn't. I always went back for more. And there was one movie that I've revisited as an adult and relieved to find that it's a brilliant movie, directed by Jack Clayton, called The Innocents, which is based on The Turn of the Screw. It's a magnificent film. Deborah Carr, Michael Redgrave, just a wonderful, wonderful film, with an ending that leaves you. Who hasn't seen The Innocents? Well, do it. Do it. I will seek each one of you out. And you know what will happen. You tell me if you still haven't seen it. But at the end of the film, I'll try not to give too much away, but you're nodding a lot. You don't know at the end of the film whether this is real, whether it happened, whether it's all in Deborah Carr's head.
Throughout the film.
And it just leaves you, boom,
Got it.
hanging. And it's a tremendously powerful ending. Why am I talking about this? Yes, ghosts. There's a lot of ghosts in The Innocents. And in particular, there's a ghost who leaves a real tear on a chalkboard in a schoolroom. That freaked the daylights out of me. How do ghosts cry real tears? Then, in the early 1970s, the very early 1970s, I would guess, right around 1970, Granada Television in the northwest of England, right after news at 10, which was the 30-minute evening news bulletin, started screening the entire Hammer back catalogue at 10:30 p.m. on Monday nights. And that was my entry, proper entry into horror films. That was where I really started to sit up and pay attention. And partly because of one particular actor who is my hero in the horror pantheon, my God, who I already knew because he had been a brilliant Sherlock Holmes for the BBC in the 1960s, and I watched that whole series avidly. He remains my favorite Sherlock Holmes, and that's Peter Cushing. And I latched on to Cushing in the Hammer movies. I run out of words. I've talked to people who worked with Cushing. They cry when they talk about him. Never heard anybody have even a whisper of a bad word about him. Bit of a strange individual, I think, in a number of ways, particularly after his wife died. He spent his whole life talking to her after she died. But what an actor. And I always point to his ability to move from that white-hot, pure intensity of his Van Helsing and flip it to play Baron Frankenstein in the Hammer Frankenstein series. And he's so brilliant that Hammer's Frankenstein movies become not about the monster, but about the Baron, about Frankenstein. And I think it's one of the great essays in Evil put on screen. As the series progresses, particularly to movies later in the series, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, Frankenstein Created Woman, Cushing's character gets more and more amoral, and he's cold. It's wonderful to watch. But it was all of the Dracula movies and all of the Frankenstein movies, and so I soaked all of those up, and then I guess I would progress from there to the Universal Classics, and when I was old enough, started, going to see horror movies in the cinema. So I was always, Clive and I and other friends in Liverpool, we'd go and see every new horror film that came out, and then we'd sit and talk about it for an hour afterwards, explore all the ideas and the themes that were going on, because that was always Clive's thing with horror. Not just was it scary, but what were the ideas, what were the themes going on. So, yes.
I think we've got time for two more. Was there another? Yes.
Kind of off topic of horror, but recently you've been involved with Blackcraft Wrestling. I'm wondering how you got involved.
Well, we're not entirely off the theme of horror. Who's not familiar with Blackcraft? I see a Blackcraft jacket and a Blackcraft hat. Does anybody not know what Blackcraft is? Okay, Blackcraft's a wonderful company that started by producing great T-shirts and hoodies and stuff. I owe most of all of this to my partner Steph, who discovered Blackcraft, and we kind of became walking billboards for Blackcraft because we just kept buying their stuff, and we got to know Bobby Shapansky, who's the main guy behind Blackcraft. We did some crossover shirts, Pinhead Blackcraft shirts, most of which were just a limited offer thing. One of them is still available to purchase. I am paying at the Blackcraft website, which Steph helped design, and it's autographed by me. And I helped them do some promotional work when they launched their dangerously wonderful whiskey. Then earlier this year, Bobby contacted Steph and said, I've got an idea. He's been a fan of wrestling for forever. I want to launch Blackcraft Cult Wrestling, and I want Doug to be involved. So his idea was that I would be the leader of the cult. And I said, okay. And that was it. Bobby didn't know anything more than that, and I certainly didn't. We needed to do some filming promotional work, like straight away. So I grabbed some items of costume, starting with my grandfather's frock coat. And very quickly, I had something pulled together, which owed a great deal to Robert Mitchum in The Night of the Hunter. Took some photos. Bobby said, that's great. What's he called? I don't know. Well, in Night of the Hunter, Robert Mitchum pretends to be a preacher.
Yes.
So he's called the Preacher, I said, because I had to say something. And it's been an improvisational process. And my serious introduction to the world of wrestling, we did the first live show in Pittsburgh in August. We were due to do a second show in Anaheim, but for various reasons, long story, never mind, it was cancelled. But we will be back in December, just down the road in Buffalo. for the second live gig, and then there are more live gigs planned in the new year. And I was as nervous as all hell approaching this, because I kept saying to Bobby, he said, why are you so anxious about it? And I said, I've no playbook for this. I don't know how to do this. You know, if you put me on the stage, you put me in a rehearsal room, I know what I'm doing. You put me on a film set with a script, I know how to do this. This, I have no idea. And it was wonderful. It was so exciting, so thrilling. The audience, I mean, wrestling audiences are like few other audiences, I think. They're so up for everything. They remind me of soccer audiences back in the UK. And I introduced the first bout, which was a ladder match. And I sort of knew what was involved with that. 4 wrestlers, and over the ring there was a chalice hanging, and the bout would be won when one wrestler got to the top of the ladder and claimed the chalice, and then I would introduce him to the cult. This thing was nuts. It was insane. Talk about, is wrestling fake? When you're very close to one fully grown man picking up another fully grown man and hurling him 20 yards across the stage so that he lands on his back on a set of steps. There's nothing fake about that. You know, you may know who's going to win in the end. And at one point, they crawled up the walkway to where I was sitting in my chair watching all of this. And one of the wrestlers left. It was in a converted old church in Pittsburgh. He goes up into the balcony and he jumps off the balcony on top of the rest of the wrestlers. And this is me in my chair as this guy goes next to me. The guy who won it got to the top of the ladder and he took the chalice, which was in a kind of plastic case, which he thought was like a breakaway thing. So he got a hold of it and decided he was going to break it open with his head. So he went against his head with it. It broke it, but it broke his head as well. And then the thing was that I come down and I get into the ring, and it was a struggle to get into the ring. Nobody had told me there'd be chairs and step ladders all over the place. So I had to pick chairs up and throw them out of the way just to get in the ring. I have a flask. I pour water into his chalice, and then he pretends to drink. Then he spits it back in my face. To be continued, because the soap opera, of course, in wrestling is everything, and that's being developed. But I'm standing in front of him, and it was very strange because I thought, oh, this is kind of familiar. I've been here before. This is like being on set. I'm standing in front of a man with blood pouring down his face and torso. Only this is real. This guy is actually bleeding. I mean, those guys are crazy in a quite wonderful way. So that's Blackcraft Wrestling, and we will be in Buffalo. It's a wonderful evening. They also had Falling in Reverse playing at the Pittsburgh show. So they're trying to bring together. It's kind of wrestling with a gothic horror twist and rock and roll. So what's not to like? And it's also available on pay-per-view on Facebook Live, I think. It was only like $10 to watch the whole thing. So I hope it's going to be. I've signed my first Preacher thing at this show.
So we gotta go. But Doug's around all day. That Scared Sacred book he's talking about, I'm contributing a chapter to that. I'm really excited to read your forward. So stay tuned. I think that's it's available for pre-order now, and it's going to ship next year.
Yeah,
something like that.
It. I'm well over deadline.
Me too, actually. And I'm also conducting a lecture. If you want to talk more about cinema and hell and cinematic depictions of hell, that's going to be in an hour and a half. I am doing that in 207. And stick around for Gremlins. Thank you so much.
Thank you.